let's start just right at the very basics. Let's get as basic as we can here. Okay. Who or what are you? I'm sure you ask yourself that question, and regardless of anything that you've heard or read or feel like you're supposed to know about who or what you are, what are you? Do the terms nama and rupa mean anything to you? Yes? Is anybody not familiar with the terms nama and rupa? Ah, okay. Okay. And then I would suppose there's probably quite a few of you who are also not familiar with what are called the 5 aggregates. Are there people who are not familiar with that concept? A few, most of it. Okay. All right. Well, we're not going to get into the 5 aggregates in detail, but for those of you that are familiar with the 5 aggregates, 4 of them are nama, they're mind. And nama actually means name, but that's the root meaning of nama in Sanskrit. But interestingly enough, it refers to anything that is mental in nature, and it's interesting to contemplate the significance of that. It doesn't mean mind literally. There are other words, vijnana or vijnana, depending on Pali or the Sanskrit, and chitta are other words that mean mind. But they say that a person consists of nama and rupa. And nama refers to the mental aspects of what you are, and rupa refers to the bodily or physical aspects of what you are. Now, when you think about it, and I want you to do so now, you're thinking about who and what am I? I am body and mind. Well, let's look at the body part of it. Are you your body? Could you conceive of your mind being in a different body? So, at least in the way that if that's true, that you could conceive of yourself as being in a different body, then that suggests that your deep down, your perception of who you are is not that you are your body. Although historically, a lot of people would have thought that, but most modern people, for all kinds of reasons, I mean, you can have parts of your body replaced. You can have somebody else's heart transplanted into your chest. You can lose your leg and have it replaced with a metal and plastic device and still walk around. Modern people rarely identify themselves with their body. And to the degree that they do, that identification is still subservient to the idea of more that I am my mind. Right? Does anybody disagrees with that? Is that not, you identify more with your mind than anything else? But when we say mind, what are we really referring to? I mean, when you think, I am my mind, what are you really referring to? Thoughts and stories? Yes. Your mind is full of thoughts and stories of who you are. And how do you come to know those thoughts and stories? You become conscious of them, right? Okay, yes. And where do they come from? Yeah. And where are the memories when you're not remembering them? Well, if you're a materialist, you might think, okay, they're in the brain somewhere, and even if you just take it from the point of view of the mind, when you're not conscious of them, they're stored somewhere in your unconscious mind, right? And where do those stories come from when they come up? They come from your unconscious mind. And probably you've all noticed that although we will say things like, I thought, what really happens when you have a thought? You become conscious of a thought. Where did the thought come from? It came from somewhere else. That's right. Somewhere else that you can't see, that you can't get at, right? Your thoughts appear in consciousness from, they're mental in nature, and so obviously a big part of your mind that is producing all these things is unconscious. And in terms of memory, sometimes you try really hard to remember something, and you know it's in there. In where? So it's in the unconscious somewhere. Please, unconscious, put it into my consciousness so I can say that person's name before I get embarrassed. Or answer the question on the test, right? Or whatever. And most of the time, your unconscious mind obliges. So who are you in this? You're your attention, but your attention is, it's part of the consciousness, right? Yeah. So is it not the case that the most accurate description that you can give to yourself of what you are is a series of conscious experiences? Yeah. And just as behind that series of conscious experiences, we hypothesize that there is this large unconscious mind that holds so much compared to what's in our consciousness at any given moment. What's in your unconscious is obviously tremendously more and doing tremendously more than what's going on in your conscious mind. In the course of your day, how many of your activities are truly conscious? Many of them, not at all. Some of them, partly so. You're mostly conscious of doing and having of doing things, but and you will tell yourself the story that I did that. Something will happen to you, and you'll experience a thought and an emotion, and you might do something, and you'll tell yourself the story that this happened to me, and so I thought about it, and I felt this way, and so I decided to do such and such. And what really happened was that an experience entered your consciousness, that it was followed by thoughts and emotions, and it was followed by an impulse to act in a particular way. And you might or might not have thought about it before you carried through on that action or that speech or whatever. But my real point here is all that you have direct experience of is your consciousness. And it seems pretty obvious to you that you have a huge part of your mind that's unconscious, right? Now this is an interesting thing compared to what I'm going to talk about when I talk about awareness and attention, okay? Because awareness and attention are kind of, as two different things, are revolutionary ideas in the same way that the idea that we have a conscious and an unconscious mind. If we went back in time to the 19th century and spoke to some of the most brilliant and most well-educated people, we would have to coax out of them, sort of like Socrates did with his students, we would have to coax out of them the recognition that there was such a thing as an unconscious mind. The idea that our mind consists of a conscious and an unconscious part is something that everyone today takes for granted, and that you all learned at some very early age. You learned it from people around you, and you took it for granted. But prior to Freud and Jung and the whole revolution in psychology that took place in the early part of the 20th century, people had no explicit recognition that their mind consisted of consciousness and an unconscious mind. Isn't that interesting? Yet, to you, it's so obvious. And of course, like I said, if we went back in time, we could coax that understanding out of a person by asking the kinds of questions that I asked you a few minutes ago. But it was a revolutionary realization. Nowadays, we translate the Sanskrit word vijnana and the Pali word vijnana, they correspond to each other, as consciousness. But for well over 2,000 years, when people used that word, vijnana or vijnana, they conflated mind with consciousness. They didn't really make a clear distinction that consciousness wasn't identical to mind. Because just like you, when you try to ask yourself who you are, what you've come up with is consciousness, and if you hadn't already had the concept of the unconscious, if you looked at your mind closely, you would have had to invent it. And that did happen, by the way. For those of you that are familiar with Buddhist Dharma and Buddhist literature, Buddhist history, when part of the Pali canon that is referred to as the Abhidhamma was created, these were all tremendous meditators who had spent a lot of time examining their own minds in meditation, investigating their own minds. And they realized that their language and their concepts didn't fully account for what they experienced. And so they noticed that they could only pay attention to one thing at a time. And so they came up with this concept of you have a series of moments of consciousness, but each moment of consciousness can only hold one thing at a time. But what they're really talking about was attention. And you know that. You can only really pay attention to one thing at a time. Well, you might have the illusion that you can pay attention to two things at a time, and sometimes three things at a time. But one of the things that you're going to find out, if you haven't already discovered this, is what's really happening is that your attention is going back and forth. When you think you're paying attention to two things at one time, your attention is going back and forth between those two things, or three things, or four things. And you know there's a limit. It's not possible to track very many things at once, because attention is bouncing around to these different things. And the more it bounces around, the less time it's on any one, right? Yeah. So here we have consciousness is somehow central to everything. We're fortunate enough that we have the recognition that there is an unconscious mind, which solves a whole lot of problems and accounts for a whole lot of things. But the followers of the Buddha who assembled the Abhidhamma had to invent something to account for what connected these moments of consciousness, which were actually moments of attention. Because they didn't distinguish between attention and awareness, but they didn't distinguish between consciousness and unconscious either. So they invented something. Well, they really invented a word to describe something. The word they invented was bhavanga. Bhavanga means the continuum of becoming. And that accounted for what linked one moment of consciousness to another. And then quite a bit later on, there was another school of Buddhism in the Mahayana called the Yogacharans. They were called the Yogacharans because they were super into meditation. You know, there's always been a scholarly aspect of Buddhism, and there's always been those Buddhists who said, no, this is all about meditating, this is all about examining your own mind. And the Yogacharans recognized, they developed a more complete picture of the mind. So they took the recognition that there was this huge part of the mind that was unconscious, remember, they only had one word, Vijnana. That's the Sanskrit. There was a Sanskrit school. They only had one word, Vijnana, which nowadays we translate as consciousness, and which they called the alaya, and it's often referred to as the alaya Vijnana, and alaya means a storehouse. So it's the storehouse consciousness, except that it's unconscious. Right? You follow what happened there? Yeah, they recognized what Freud articulated very clearly much, much later. They recognized that, and they fit it into their conceptual picture of things. They also, there's another Vijnana that they recognize the presence of that is referred to as the I consciousness. That's the part of your mind that tells the story of who you are. Yeah. Yeah. And so they added that. Prior to that, it spoke of 6 kinds of consciousness: eye consciousness, ear consciousness, touch consciousness, smell consciousness, taste consciousness, and mind consciousness, all referring to the object. And mind consciousness meant being conscious of thoughts and emotions and memories and things like that. So they added to this 6, the manas, or I consciousness, the consciousness that tells the story of who you are, and the alaya, which is the storehouse consciousness, was really the unconscious mind. And this helped a lot. It helped them enormously because they were meditating, and now they had a way to think conceptually about what they were experiencing in their meditation, which was of tremendous value to them. And they also used it in the further development of Dharma concepts. And so the alaya Vijnana was, of course, what it was the storehouse of. It was a storehouse of your karma, of your conditioning, of those invisible factors that determined who you are, your personality, your characteristics, the traits that you have, that you manifest, that we would call your personality. So the picture that I'm trying to paint for you and to prepare you for a further revolution in the recognition of what and who we are in terms of our mind. So historically, only those people who are deeply steeped in certain Buddhist doctrines recognized explicitly that there was an unconscious and a conscious mind. And everybody else kind of lived in the fantasy world of the narrating mind, the manas that tells the story, not realizing that where do these thoughts come from? Where do these impulses and inclinations come from? They come from unconscious mind. And now we can look at consciousness and understand it in a clearer way. And really, what's really interesting about this, it's really important that we do this, because it's really the only thing we experience. Let's take the other aspect of what a person is. Nama and Rupa. Rupa is your body. Seems solid. My hand can feel my leg. My eyes can see. I see that you have legs, and you have arms, you have eyes. I'm feeling, I can feel my eyes. I can see with my eyes. I can tell they're like your eyes. I can look in a mirror. But wait a minute. If I close my eyes and put my hand on my leg, all there are is sensations. There are sensations that come from my hand and the sensations that come from my leg. If I touch a material object, it's just the sensations that come from my hand. I open my eyes and I look at my body, and I look at other people's bodies, and I put that together with the feelings that I have. And I create in my mind a body. But what really does your mind know? Conscious or unconscious, what really does your mind know? Consciously, what do you ever really know about this body? You experience sensations only. So Rupa, although it means body, in a sense, whatever is really out there that is carrying your mind around, you don't really know it directly. You only know it through the sensations that arise in your mind. So, very interesting, isn't it? So everything comes back to the mind, and it comes back to consciousness. And now, here we are, we're seekers after truth. So are scientists. At one point in my life, I wanted to be a physicist. As a matter of fact, in my adolescence, I formed the very powerful wish and motivation that has driven me my entire life of wanting to know what truly is, wanting to know the truth about who and what I am and this universe is, and so forth. And to me, I saw two possible paths. One was science, and one was spirituality. Not going to church and saying prayers spirituality, but those kinds of deep mystical experiences which I had heard and read about, that you've heard and read about, that are supposed to give us profound insight into the truth of what is, right? We're seekers after that truth. And we realize that all we have to work with is our consciousness. So we're a series of conscious experiences, and what constitutes consciousness is really, really important. And so we sit down and we close our eyes, and we examine our mind as a pathway to find truth. Like I say, there was a point in my life where I wanted to go into physics, because that's the other pathway that you can go into, is to study the physical universe that we know through our senses and through the machines that we build as extensions of our senses. And that's really all that they are. And we know that our senses are limited. After all, dogs can hear sounds that we can't. Birds can see colors that we can't. And we're limited by our senses. And our senses have been extended by various machines that we've built. But we're still limited. As a matter of fact, we don't even know where to look outside of that which relates to our senses. Science is one way of pursuing truth, and looking inside is the other way of pursuing truth. And as meditators, you may also be scientists. I became a scientist, and I chose to study in particular the brain because I realized that spiritual, I shouldn't say meditation, because at that point I saw spirituality, looking inward and discovering some greater truth that was not discoverable through the external senses, was one of the paths to truth. And examining the physical world of which I was a part was another, and that my mind and my brain were related. And so I set myself to studying my brain from the inside through meditation, and my mind from the outside through neuroscience, in search of this greater truth. And so that kind of brings us to the place why we're all here together. We're all meditators, and I think you are all, to some degree, are you not, seeking some greater, deeper understanding of yourself, of the reality that you're a part of? Well, it's possible that not everyone is that's here tonight. And some of you may have come to meditation as a way to reduce the stress in your life and to be more productive and to improve the quality of your relationships and to become a happier and more well-adjusted person. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. But even if that was your motivation to come to meditation, I warrant that there is a part of you that is longing for the answer to these existential questions of who in the heck, what in the heck am I, and what is this all about anyway? No? Right. And so we meditate. And some of you have probably been meditating for quite a long time. And there's probably represented in this room quite a few different meditation techniques, different methods, right? That you've learned and that you've practiced. Well, in all the meditation instruction that I was exposed to, and this is probably true for the vast majority of you, a lot is said about attention, right? A lot is said about attention. The other word that comes up a lot is mindfulness. And how many of you can, just raise your hand if you think you can give a really good definition of what mindfulness is? How many of you have a vague sense of what it is? And yet, you hear and read about all these people who sound like they know they know exactly what mindfulness is, right? But attention, you know what that is, right? And when people talk about mindfulness, what do they say? They say things like, mindfulness, one of the definitions that you probably heard, mindfulness is paying attention on purpose and non-judgmentally. Is that a definition that you've heard? Of the different methods of meditation that I tried, and over the years there were many. There was TM. That was one of the first ones that really produced anything for me. I got a mantra, and I was so excited because actually I was able to do something and have some experiences that looked like they were heading in the right direction. But I was told to repeat this mantra and to pay attention to it. And what happened to me when I did that is I'd be paying attention to the mantra, and then I'd realized that I'd been mind-wandering, I'd been thinking about things. But I completely forgot why I was sitting there in that chair, And then later on, when I learned Mahasi-style Vipassana noting practice, I'd sit down and observe the rise and fall of my abdomen, and some distraction would come up and I would label it and I would go back to the rise and fall. And it wouldn't be long though before I would suddenly realize that my mind had just taken a trip around my private little world. And I had totally forgot what I was sitting there. By that time I was sitting on a cushion instead of a chair. And the thing that was confusing about all of this is that two words would be used, but they would be used interchangeably. Focus your attention on the rise and fall of your abdomen, just like focus your attention on the breath. And it sounded like there wasn't supposed to be anything else in my mind. Oh yeah, I tried some yoga meditation techniques too as well. If you're familiar with Advaita Vedanta, that was one of the things that I tried. And, I tried meditating on candle flames and things like that. Later on, it was visualizing things. But it was always the same thing. It was always talk about paying attention and be aware of and focus your awareness, focus your attention. The two words were used more or less interchangeably. But my personal experience was that I could focus my attention on something, but I couldn't shut out all of this other stuff. All of this other stuff was present at the same time. And it always seemed like I wasn't following the instructions. Have you had that experience? Have you had that feeling that it seems like, everything else is supposed to disappear? Quiet your mind. So I would envy those people who said, I just sit there and I just became my breath, and that's all there was. There was nothing else. And that was not what was happening in my mind. And the other thing, too, of course, is getting drowsy and falling asleep. Okay? And there's something that all those people teaching meditation knew, who were trying to tell us, but they didn't have a conceptual framework to do it in. They didn't have the words, they didn't have the language to tell us. And they're still doing that. They're still doing that, and they're throwing around this word mindfulness, and they're using attention and awareness interchangeably and things like this. Well, it started to become clearer and clearer to me that whatever I did with my attention, it was really hard to stop being aware of other things. And the only time I ever seemed to be able to stop being aware of other things, and see, and now I'm starting to use attention and awareness in the sense that I want to use it from here on. But the only time I stopped being aware of other things, I also soon fell asleep. And those people that I was envying, the teacher would say, relaxed alertness, but they weren't alert. They would say, I had a great meditation. I don't know where I went, but I was gone. That's not alertness. I had this alertness where I was struggling to, I knew that I was knowing all of these other things. I knew that these thoughts kept coming up. I knew that I was feeling sensations in my body that were generating thoughts like, oh, that's uncomfortable. Oh, I really want to move. Oh, I'm not supposed to move. Wait a minute, I'm thinking. I'm not supposed to be thinking. Okay, all right. And it would keep going on. And I was starting to have the same realization that my teachers had, but which they were incapable of articulating, which is that I was intuiting that there were two different processes taking place. And there was only one of them that I was in control of. And I had to really struggle to control it because it was always wanting to go off. And, it was saying, okay, the breath, the Buddha image, the mantra, whatever it happened to be, it would say, okay, that's fine. Okay, let's move on. No, come back. Or it would just get caught by something, right? And then there was this other process that was going on that I kept trying to shut down. And I really started to make progress when I stopped trying to shut it down. So it was really kind of a giving up, but it was a giving up that opened things up. And at that point, my meditation became what I always wanted it to be. I was starting to pay attention to my own, now I'm not using the word correct. I was starting to know what was going on in my own mind. I was starting to have a bigger picture. Yes, there's my attention. It's on the breath. Oh, that's great. Oh, my attention is on a thought now. Oh, okay. Well, I'll bring it back to the breath. Okay, there's still those thoughts there, though. Actually, it wasn't just that thought. There were a bunch of thoughts. They keep coming and going. And all kinds of stimuli. Somebody next to me in the room would cough, and I would react to that. And my attention would go to that. I'd say, no, come back, okay. Yeah. But I stopped fighting against being aware of everything else. And my attention, my meditation started being more of what I'd always wanted it to be. But I didn't quite understand, and I still had the feeling that I was doing something wrong. Because somehow I was supposed to know my mind, but I shouldn't be having all these thoughts at the same time. I should just be knowing my mind. And I shouldn't be feeling all these things I was feeling and hearing all these things that I was hearing and having the thoughts and emotions that arose in response to that. And I wasn't supposed to be getting annoyed at myself and everything. But that was happening anyway. And I felt better when I wasn't fighting against it, and I actually knew my meditation was giving me what I wanted, but I felt kind of guilty because it didn't sound like I was doing what it said in the books. It didn't sound like I was doing what the teacher was saying, right? And then, as having an interest in neuroscience and cognitive science, I noticed, I realized that what the cognitive scientists were starting to say, and they didn't have a language for it either. They would use different words like, they also would conflate attention and awareness, but they would talk about focused attention and broad attention, and they would talk about explicit and implicit knowing. They were using different terminologies, but what they were doing is making up a list of characteristics of these two different ways of knowing. And then the neuroscientists got on the bandwagon, and they noticed that when you got subjects to do these kinds of things that fit this list of a way of knowing, that depending on whether you're doing electroencephalography or whether you were doing fMRIs or whatever, that there are completely different brain processes involved than when you got people to do things that belong to this list of ways of knowing. When you got people to do focused task sorts of things, then there were areas in the brain that lit up in the fMRI that were located on the dorsal, that's the upper surface, and lateral parts of both hemispheres of the brain. And when you got people to do things that involved a kind of vigilance, a kind of, the kind of state that a deer would be in naturally, right? That sort of open awareness. When you got people to do tasks, then completely different regions of the brain would light up that were more on the undersurface, the ventral surface, and the medial surface, the two sides where the two hemispheres face each other, and were predominantly on the right side of the brain. So this was all of a sudden, this crystallized into an understanding. Yes, we have these two completely different ways of knowing. And the cognitive scientists had made a list of the characteristics of this one way of knowing, and the neuroscientists had shown that completely different parts of the brain were involved in that way of perceiving, that mode of perception. And then there's this other mode of perception that had a completely different set of characteristics, and that was associated with activity in completely different parts of the brain, different neural circuitry. And I took that into my own personal experience, and all of a sudden everything made sense. This one way of knowing, let's start playing with my slides. I had all these wonderful slides made for me. And these are all from my book. So here is a model of conscious experience that I generated based on the published information on cognitive neuroscience and anatomical neuroscience. So you have a field of conscious awareness. In any given moment, you have a field of conscious awareness. And it includes a lot of things. So that is kind of that's the most accurate description of what your experience is, most of the moment to moment, isn't it? You have a field of conscious awareness, and wait a minute, let me, yes, why didn't I do this for you? There you go. Now you can see the slide. So it consists of whatever you're experiencing in the moment. So this person is, they're having a thought. They're aware that they're holding a teacup. They're aware of the sound of music playing on a radio. They're aware of sounds of traffic. There's a window with a tree outside. There's a dog in the room. They're aware of all these things at the same time. That's their field of conscious awareness. And isn't this the way it happens, that you can be paying attention to one thing, but you're still aware of everything else at the same time? But there's a qualitative difference in what's in that circle, what you're focusing your attention on. When you shift that focus to something else, you become more fully conscious of it, and everything else remains there in the background, right? I mean, this has been my experience my whole life. And this was my experience in my meditation, which I'd been fighting against, and which I finally surrendered to, and my meditations got better. So, attention and peripheral awareness are two different ways of knowing the world. Over this weekend, you're going to see that how important this distinction becomes. I'm still in the process, in my own studies, and in the work that's being done. I'm still in the process of discovering the enormous ramifications of this. They are absolutely enormous. We have simultaneously these two ways of experiencing the world. Attention singles out some small part of the content of the field of conscious awareness from the rest, and it analyzes it, and it interprets it, and it particularly interprets it in relation to ourselves. And it only stays on something that has some kind of importance to ourselves. I mean, you focus your attention on something, say you have a hobby and you're making something and you focus your attention on it. What your attention is focused on is the source of your satisfaction and enjoyment. And your attention stays on it because it's making you feel good. You focus your attention on something when you're at work because you get paid to do that, and if you didn't focus attention on it and things went haywire, you'd lose your job, right? So you've got a good personal reason for paying attention to it. But at the same time, you have peripheral awareness. And peripheral awareness is holistic. It's open. It's inclusive. It has a lot of things in it. Whereas attention just isolates something out of the field of conscious awareness. Conscious awareness is everything else that you're conscious of. The thing that you'll notice about awareness when you start to think in these, when you bring this conceptual framework to the experience that you've been living your entire life and in your meditation, you'll start to recognize these different characteristics. What is present in peripheral awareness isn't highly conceptualized. And it's actually the relationship of everything that's in the field of conscious awareness that stands out and is more significant. So what I found, and what I passed on to you, and what worked wonders for me, was that you work with attention and peripheral awareness to cultivate stable attention and mindfulness. The two main objectives of your meditation that everybody's been telling you, that if you do this practice and follow the instructions I give you, you're going to develop stable attention and mindfulness, right? But and then you struggle to do it, and sometimes, if you're lucky, it will happen to you, and it takes a long time because you don't know what you're doing. But the difference is that once you have a conceptual framework to put it in, once you can examine it, and then you realize you can use these two things. One of the things that Stable attention is the ability to direct and sustain the focus of attention and to control the scope of attention. It's one of the things you want to develop in meditation. And you all know how hard that is, right? Because attention moves spontaneously. There's 3 different ways it moves spontaneously. One is scanning. So even while you're sitting there focused on the breath, or sitting there listening to the conversation of somebody else, at the same time your attention is bouncing all over the place, looking for something that might be important or of more interest. And so it moves around spontaneously. And of course, any one of these things, if it is more important, of more interest, it will capture your attention. And that's what happens. It's one of the things that happens to you in your meditation. The second kind of spontaneous movement happens when attention gets captured by something. So that's when a thought with a lot of emotional content arises in your mind in meditation, and boom, you're gone and you forget that you were meditating. Or there's a loud sound and you start, you're meditating and the dog starts barking next door. And you start having thoughts about how annoying that is. And, of course you're in the city, maybe you don't have that experience as much, but, you can picture what it's like outside of New York City where somebody might be meditating in their bedroom and the neighbor's dog is chained up outside and unhappy and barking. And you start to think about that poor dog and those nasty neighbors, and why should I have to put up with this and all that kind of stuff. Something captures your attention. And the third kind of spontaneous movement is where attention alternates between 2 or more things. What you're after is to get to a place where spontaneous movements of attention stop and your attention remains wherever you put it. Now, there's 2 purposes in this. There's two valuable things that come from this. Okay? The first thing is early in the meditative process, when you're learning to stabilize attention, you're also learning to develop strong peripheral awareness, and I'll explain why that's so important. But you can't have good, strong, clear peripheral awareness when your attention is bouncing all over the place. So the main reason for, nobody ever pointed this out to me, but I'm going to point it out to you, and I guarantee you it's going to make a big difference in your meditation. Why am I trying to focus my object on this, my attention on this particular object anyway? What is so magical about having your attention focused on the breath or anything else you could think of? It gets it out of the way. That's the first good thing about it. It gets it out of the way so that you can develop a really powerful peripheral awareness, which you can in turn use to help stabilize your attention. Which, as your attention becomes more stable, not only does your peripheral awareness become stronger, but you can begin to direct it internally and start to experience your own mind directly and see what's happening in your own mind. So that's one of the reasons why just about every meditation practice that you come across is, even though the people teaching it, even the people that develop that practice historically through the process of trial and error and everything else, even though they may not have been able to articulate it because they didn't have attention and awareness as 2 distinct concepts, they didn't have the benefit of what I found from cognitive science and neuroscience. But the reason that they're always trying to get you to stabilize your attention is that the only way that that's going to happen is for you to have enough peripheral awareness to keep your attention from moving, and the only way you're going to have that much peripheral awareness is to keep your attention anchored to something, and so that's why they always teach it that way. And now it makes sense. Now all of a sudden you can see why. Well, the part that we didn't answer yet is, so like, what's so great about having really strong peripheral awareness? other than it helps you to develop stable attention. Kind of going in a circle here now, aren't we? There must be something really, really valuable about that, right? And there is. The other thing that they're telling you in one form or another, and they might not use the word mindfulness in some of the systems you practice in, but they're talking about the same thing, is mindfulness. And mindfulness is the optimal interaction between attention and peripheral awareness. And mindfulness in meditation is what's going to allow you to develop the skills to be the kind of meditator who has deep insight and who will eventually experience awakening. And that's also mindfulness, when you bring it into your daily life, is also what's going to make all kinds of dramatic changes in your life. When you're mindful in your daily life, you don't react so quickly. You respond. You're more likely to respond rather than react. When you have an optimal interaction between peripheral awareness and attention, you take into account the context of the situation you're in. An example that I often use is you're in an interaction with somebody that you care about, and they say or do something that pushes one of your buttons, and you say or do something that's very hurtful to them. Well, what happened is that you went out of, you lost the context. And that happens to us all the time. We lose our mindfulness, and then we react instead of respond. And we do things that we regret. Afterwards we say, why did I do that? Afterwards we find ourselves trying to clean up the mess we made from not being mindful. It's the optimal interaction. In meditation, though, it's how we... let's just review the characteristics of peripheral awareness and attention. Peripheral awareness is holistic, relational, and contextual. Attention isolates and analyzes. Peripheral awareness filters all incoming information. There's something that you will find out now that you've got a conceptual framework to observe in, is that everything that you ever pay attention to first appears in awareness before it becomes an object of attention. Now, it takes a while to realize that that's 100% true for everything. Initially, it will be obvious to you that most things, you'll say, yes, I was aware of that before my attention went to it. As a matter of fact, my attention could not have gone to it had it not been present in my field of conscious awareness first. Had I not already known it was there, my attention couldn't have gone to it. But there will be things like you'll say, well, a door slamming, my attention went to that right away. As your perceptual acuity increases, you'll realize that you're aware of the sound before your attention went to it. And if this were, we can measure what happens in the brain, and we can show that the parts of your mind that function to produce the phenomenon of awareness receive that information before the parts of your mind that involve attention became activated by that particular thing. Awareness acts as a watchful alert system. I gave you the example of a deer. A deer has to be, it's a prey animal. There's all kinds of predators that would like to eat that deer for lunch. It has to have a lot of awareness to avoid getting eaten. Attention hones in on something. Now, if there's a particular sound that awareness alerts attention to, attention will go and focus on that particular unusual, unrecognized sound. If you're a deer, it will be to see if that sound is something that you better run away from. And if it can't identify it, if it identifies it as something safe and familiar, the deer just goes back to browsing, doing whatever it was doing. But if it doesn't know what it is, or if it identifies it as something to be afraid of, the deer runs away, right? Peripheral awareness involves less processing and quicker responses. And attention is much slower. It involves serial processing. When the deer starts running, you ever watch deer run away from something? I had that opportunity. Or rabbits, or any kind of... But I get to watch deer a lot. I live in a place where there's a lot of deer. They take off running, and they're jumping over obstacles, and they're going between trees and under limbs and things like this at an incredible speed. And believe me, they are not paying attention to these things and analyzing, should I go right or left around this tree? All that is happening. There's less processing taking place. There's only one purpose, and that is what is the most direct path away from whatever it is that made that deer start running. And so it doesn't need to do much. All of that's the only processing that needs to happen. And it happens, and the deer is in a state of awareness. And it's amazing. You watch it, wow, it's almost like it was already programmed and knew where to go. As a matter of fact, in your daily life, you'll start to recognize that you're responding to things in your awareness all of the time. And that if you had to respond to all of these things with attention, that you get really bogged down very, very quickly. Just take the example of when you're having a conversation and eating a meal. If you had to direct your attention to the process of eating, your dinner conversation would constantly be interrupted, right? And you'd probably forget what you're talking about half the time. And certainly you'd miss what the other person was saying over and over again. But that doesn't happen, does it? Awareness allows you to take all these actions, to enjoy your meal, to even savor the flavor while you're carrying on the conversation. One of the most interesting things about awareness is it's very allocentric, other-centered, less personal, more objective. You experience awareness just as you are a point of view in perspective, not as a self. Whereas attention is very self-centered. And a lot of what attention is doing, what happens when you don't have something to do? Let's say you're sitting idly on the subway somewhere, and your mind doesn't have anything in particular to focus on. What is your attention doing? It's kind of running around all kinds of things, worries that you have about yourself or things that happen to you or what you need to do, stuff like that, right? Yeah. Attention is more self-centered, and both can be introspective or extrospective. Now, I have to explain those words there. Extrospective means everything outside your mind. Introspective means inside your mind. But peripheral awareness can be introspective and extrospective at the same time. You can be aware of sounds and sensations in your body which originate outside your mind at the same time that you are aware of thoughts and emotions arising in your mind. Right? Attention's different. You're either paying attention to a sensation or a sound, or you're paying attention to the thought or emotion that arose in response to it. But you can't pay attention to both things at once. And as a matter of fact, when you look introspectively, basically the only thing you find is that you're looking introspectively, unless what you look for is whatever it was you were aware of before you looked introspectively with your attention. You're nodding your head. You know what I'm talking about. Huh? Yeah, right. Yeah, well, that's what you'll find. And that's one of the things that you'll do in meditation. What we want to, the way we want to use these things in meditation is to, let me see. Well, I think I'm just, I'll just put this slide back up then. The way you use this in meditation is, first of all, that moment when you realize that your mind was wandering and you weren't meditating. That was an example of spontaneous introspective awareness that became an object of attention. Right? Some part of you knew that this wasn't what you intended to do, and you woke up and you became present again. Right? And not only that, it felt wonderful. By comparison, I use the word wake up. By comparison, in that moment of epiphany when you realize that you've been thinking about something instead of meditating, you feel awake compared to where you were when you were lost in the thought before. It was almost a dreamlike lostness, even though you weren't asleep and it wasn't a dream. You reinforce that. And that's how you overcome mind wandering and forgetting. Usually what happens for most people, it's what used to happen to me, when I discover that I've been mind wandering instead of meditating, is I'd get mad at myself. But it might have been 30 seconds ago or it might have been 5 minutes ago that I forgot that I was supposed to be meditating and got lost in that thought. So that anger that I direct towards myself, what does it get associated with? The most recent event that occurred in my mind, which was waking up to the fact that I was mind wandering. So you do just the opposite. Feel really good about waking up. Say, wow, okay, this is the place I'd like to live in. I'd like to be this way all the time. And then you gently, very gently go back to meditation object and you try to stay awake as long as you can, knowing that you'll probably forget again and that your mind will wander. But every time that happens, you repeat that experience of, pat yourself on the back, hip hip hooray, this is how I want to be, good for me, I woke up. And it happens more often and more easily until you stop forgetting and you stop mind wandering. As you go along and you develop more introspective awareness, you can start to see when, you remember the alternating attention that I talked about? One of your meditation experiences will be that you're focusing on your meditation object, your breath, for example, if you're meditating on the breath. And you're also paying attention to a thought at the same time. There's a thought that stands out from the background from everything else. It stands out because your attention is alternating back and forth. And that gradually that thought gets more and more attention, and your breath gets less and less attention, until there's some point where the thought is getting more attention than the breath is. And at that point, you're at a great risk of forgetting. We have a term for that. We call that a gross distraction, to distinguish it between from a subtle distraction. When your mind is alternating with something, but still spending more time on the meditation object, then it's a subtle distraction. As you develop more introspective awareness, you can see when a gross distraction is present. And you can refocus your attention on your meditation object, and you won't forget. So you're using peripheral awareness, and you're also strengthening peripheral awareness. And you start to have longer and longer periods of time where you don't forget. and your peripheral awareness gets stronger, and your attention becomes more stable. Eventually, you'll be able to detect the presence of subtle distractions before they become gross distractions and keep that from happening. Eventually, your introspective awareness will become so strong that all these corrections happen automatically, and you just notice that, my attention started to go to something, but then my mind corrected automatically. And you find that you now have attentional stability and powerful peripheral awareness that is very introspective. And at that point, you're a good meditator. At that point, you're a better meditator than the vast majority of people who have been out there meditating for many years.